The rain fell on the city like a punishment. It was a relentless steel-gray deluge that blurred the glass towers of the financial district into watercolor smudges and turned the streets below into churning rivers of black water and reflected neon. From her station behind the stainless steel counter of the Blackwood Enterprises cafeteria, Elara Vance watched the storm with a familiar sense of detachment. The weather was just another force beyond her control, like the mounting stack of bills on her small apartment's kitchen table, or the phantom ache of a failed marriage that still clung to her bones. She moved with an unconscious grace that was utterly wasted on her surroundings. Her hands, which could once coax magic from flour and fire, now methodically arranged pre-packaged sandwiches into perfect uninspired rows. Her fingers, nimble enough to pipe delicate sugar flowers, now wiped down a sticky spot of spilled soda. She was a culinary artist, trapped in a still-life painting of beige and gray, her vibrant talents muted by the fluorescent hum and the smell of reheated chili. Every day was a carbon copy of the last. The morning rush of caffeine-starved analysts, their eyes glued to their phones, barely registering her existence. The lunchtime wave of executives in sharp suits discussing billion-dollar mergers over trays of bland salads and healthy choice wraps that tasted of quiet desperation. Elara saw them all, but they never truly saw her. She was part of the building's machinery, as functional and invisible as the air conditioning vents, or the silent elevators that whisked the powerful up to the sky. Today, the storm seemed to have seeped inside, making the air thick with a restless energy. The low, distant rumble of thunder was a constant underscore to the clatter of trays and the drone of conversations. Elara's focus was singular finish, her shift collect her meager paycheck, and maybe, if she was lucky, afford the rare ingredients for a small, perfect creme brulee. She could make for herself a tiny rebellion against the blandness of her life. Then he appeared. A hush fell over the cafeteria, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with the weather. Damian Blackwood moved through the space, not like he owned it, which he did, but like he was a predator passing through a field of grazing animals. The chatter died. The clinking of forks ceased. Everyone from the mailroom clerk to the senior vice president froze their gazes, averted their bodies, instinctively making way. He was a man sculpted from shadows and sharp angles. His suit was a dark, immaculate armor, his hair the color of midnight. But it was his eyes that held the true power chips of glacial ice that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. He never touched anyone. He never allowed anyone to get too close. A sterile bubble of personal space at least 3 feet in diameter surrounded him at all times, a force field of pure, intimidating will. The staff whispered stories about him, that he was a germaphobe, that he was pathologically shy, that he was simply an arrogant billionaire who considered the rest of humanity a contaminant. Elara had only seen him a handful of times, always from a distance. He never ate here. His presence was a rare disruptive event, usually signaling that someone was about to be fired. He walked directly to the coffee station, his movements precise and economical. He poured himself a black coffee, his gaze fixed on the dark liquid as if it were the only thing in the room worthy of his attention. As he turned to leave, his path brought him closer to her counter than he had ever been before. For a fraction of a second, his icy gaze swept over her station, not at her, but through her, and Elara felt an involuntary shiver. It was like being assessed by a winter storm. Then, just as he reached the exit, the world went dark. It wasn't a flicker. It was an abrupt, total severance from the grid. The lights, the monitors, the humming refrigerators. Everything died in an instant. A collective gasp echoed through the pitch-black room, followed by a nervous ripple of murmurs. The emergency lights flickered on a moment later, casting the cafeteria in a ghostly, alien glow. The thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening, violent roar that shook the entire building. Panic low and electric began to prickle the air. People fumbled for their phones, their faces illuminated by the small, anxious screens. Elara remained still, her hand resting on the cool steel of the counter. She had weathered worse storms than this. "Everyone please remain calm," a manager's voice boomed, trying to sound authoritative and failing. "It's just a city-wide outage. The backup generators for the elevators and emergency systems will hold." Elara's shift was over. All she wanted was to go home. She untied her apron, tucked it away, and grabbed her worn satchel from a locker. She moved through the panicked clusters of people towards the main elevator bank, hoping to get out before a full-blown lockdown was initiated. She saw him again, standing near the elevators, a solitary figure silhouetted against the emergency light. Damian Blackwood was looking up at the floor indicator, his jaw tight. He seemed irritated, not scared. When an elevator dinged, its doors sliding open with a low hum from the backup power, he stepped inside without hesitation. Elara, driven by her own desire to escape, slipped in just before the doors closed, her sneakers making no sound on the marble floor. She pressed the button for the ground floor, keenly aware of the man standing in the opposite corner. The air inside the small cabin was thick with the scent of his expensive cologne and the ozone smell of the storm. The elevator began its descent, a slow humming cage suspended in the wounded building. They were passing the 20th floor when it happened. A deep, groaning shudder vibrated through the floor, followed by a sickening lurch. The humming of the generator died. The emergency light inside the cabin flickered once, twice, and then went out. The elevator stopped. The darkness that followed was absolute. It was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating, swallowing all light and sound, except for the frantic drumming of Elara's own heart and the sound of the rain lashing against the building outside. For a moment there was only silence. "Hello," Elara's voice was small in the oppressive dark. No answer. Then she heard it, a sharp, ragged intake of breath from the corner. It wasn't a sound of annoyance. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Are you all right?" she asked, her own fear momentarily forgotten. Another gasp, this one sharper, followed by a choked, rasping noise. The man, the powerful, untouchable Damian Blackwood, was hyperventilating. She could hear him moving, a frantic shuffling sound and then a soft thud as he slid down the wall to the floor. His breathing grew more erratic, the desperate, panicked gasps of a drowning man. "Sir, Mr. Blackwood." His only response was a low, guttural moan, a sound of such profound agony that it cut through Elara's fear and struck a chord of raw empathy. This wasn't the cold CEO. This was a man breaking apart in the dark. Fragments of memory, sharp as shrapnel, tore through Damian's mind. Twisted metal, the smell of gasoline and burning rubber, the high, keening siren, the suffocating darkness of being trapped, the weight of the dashboard pressing on his small legs, fire orange and hungry licking at the edges of his vision. A woman's face framed by the shattered window, her hand reaching for him. Her scream of terror as the second car hit, turning his rescue into another catastrophe. Touch, fire, pain, darkness. He curled into a ball on the floor, his hands clamped over his ears, trying to block out the ghosts that were clawing their way out of the abyss of his memory. Elara knew this kind of fear. She had seen it in the eyes of shelter animals, felt it in the tremors of her own hands after Markham had raised his voice one too many times. It was a fear that logic couldn't touch. Instinct took over. She slid her satchel from her shoulder, her fingers fumbling in the dark until they found the small cloth pouch she always carried. She opened it, and a soft, calming scent began to permeate the small space. It was a blend she'd created herself, lavender and chamomile for peace, and a deeper, earthier note of clary sage and vetiver scents that smelled of damp soil and ancient forests of grounding and safety. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't move closer, not wanting to crowd him. "You're not there. You're here. You're in an elevator. It's just dark." She began to speak, her voice low and steady, weaving a story out of the darkness. It was a simple tale her grandmother used to tell her about a boy who was afraid of the night, until a star taught him how to map his way home by its light. She didn't know if he was listening, but she kept talking, her words a soft, steady anchor in the storm of his terror. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rhythm of his breathing began to change. The frantic, ragged gasps softened, deepening into shaky, but more regular breaths. The scent of the herbs filled the cabin, a fragrant balm against the sharp edges of his panic. He was still lost adrift in the wreckage of his past, but her voice was a lighthouse, a single point of light in an ocean of darkness. Without thinking, driven by a primal need for an anchor, he reached out blindly. His hand brushed against her leg. He should have recoiled. His entire being was wired to retreat from a woman's touch, to equate it with imminent disaster. Every cell in his body screamed at him to pull back, but he didn't. Her warmth, the simple living heat of another person, was a shock to his system. It wasn't a threat. It was a tether. His fingers, trembling, curled around the rough fabric of her jeans. Elara froze, her story catching in her throat. She felt his desperate, clutching grip. She should have been scared, but all she felt was the profound, aching vulnerability of the man on the floor. She remained perfectly still, letting him hold on her voice, resuming its soft storytelling cadence. His terror slowly receded, replaced by a raw, overwhelming need for comfort. He shifted, moving closer in the dark, not with aggression, but with the desperation of a lost child. His head came to rest against her lap, his body still trembling, but the frantic energy was gone. His hand moved from her leg to her hand, his fingers lacing with hers, his grip tight and grounding. In the absolute anonymous darkness, they were not a CEO and a cafeteria worker. They were two souls stripped of their armor, finding a fragile temporary shelter in each other. He was drowning, and she was the only solid thing in the void. He held on to her as if she were life itself. His breathing slowly evening out against the soft fabric of her worn-out jeans, the scent of her herbs, and the sound of her voice, the only reality. Just as a fragile piece settled in the small, dark space, the generator kicked back on with a loud groan. The emergency light in the elevator flickered, then burst into harsh, unforgiving life. The world rushed back in. Damian flinched as if struck, recoiling from her instantly. He scrambled back to his corner, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. Elara stared at him, her heart pounding, the warmth of his hand still a phantom sensation on her own. The powerful CEO was gone, and in his place was a man who looked utterly broken and ashamed. The elevator lurched again, and with a familiar hum it resumed its descent. Neither of them spoke. The silence was now a chasm of awkwardness and shock. When the doors finally slid open on the ground floor, Damian practically bolted out, not looking back. His posture rigid, his armor firmly back in place. Elara remained for a moment, her breath shaky, trying to process what had just happened. She slowly got to her feet, her legs unsteady. As she stepped out into the lobby, hurrying away in the opposite direction, a single dried leaf of clary sage, small and gray-green, fell from the cuff of her jeans and landed silently on the polished marble floor of the elevator cabin. The world Damian Blackwood inhabited was a fortress of glass, steel, and silence. His penthouse apartment, occupying the entire top floor of a skyscraper that bore his name, was a masterpiece of minimalist austerity. There were no photographs, no sentimental trinkets, no clutter. Every surface was polished to a sterile gleam, every piece of furniture an exercise in severe geometric precision. It was a space designed not to be lived in, but to be controlled. And for 20 years, control had been Damian's god. Yet in the week following the storm, the fortress had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a memory. He would be in the middle of a conference call dissecting a hostile takeover with surgical precision, when the phantom scent of lavender and damp earth would drift into his consciousness. He would be staring at a spreadsheet, the numbers marching in their orderly columns, and would instead hear the faint melodic cadence of a woman's voice telling a story about the stars. He would wake in the middle of the night, not from the usual nightmares of fire and screaming, but from a disorienting dream of darkness that was not terrifying, but calm. His reaction was one of profound self-disgust. He had lost control. He, Damian Blackwood, a man who commanded a global empire with an iron will, had crumbled on the floor of an elevator like a frightened child. He had allowed a woman, a stranger, to touch him. The thought should have sent waves of his usual revulsion through him. It should have triggered the cold sweat, the tightening in his chest, the visceral need to scrub his skin raw. But it didn't. Beneath the shame, buried deep, was a lingering echo of the peace he had felt. It was a foreign, unsettling sensation, a warmth in the frozen landscape of his soul. He had spent 2 decades building walls to keep the world out, and in 15 minutes of darkness a complete stranger had slipped through every defense he had. He didn't know if he wanted to hunt her down or erase her from his memory forever. The morning after the incident, as his housekeeper laid out his perfectly pressed suit, he'd noticed it. A tiny gray-green leaf clinging to the wool of his trousers. It was not a common leaf. It was dry, fragrant, and uniquely shaped. He had picked it from the fabric, his fingers strangely hesitant. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, and the faint, earthy scent of clary sage rose to meet him. It was her. It was the scent of the calm. He placed the leaf in a small, sterile glass box on his desk, a piece of inexplicable chaos in his world of order. For days he stared at it, a tangible link to an intangible moment. The mystery of her gnawed at him, an unsolved equation. Who was she? How had she known what to do? How had she, with only a scent and a story, silenced the demons that therapists and medication could only muffle? Finally, unable to bear the unanswered questions, he summoned his assistant. Arthur Pendleton was a man who thrived on order and logic. He had served Damian for a decade, navigating his boss's extreme reclusiveness and peculiar demands with unflappable competence. He had sourced hypoallergenic fabrics from Sweden, arranged for entire boardrooms to be sanitized before Damian's arrival, and memorized the psychological profiles of every executive Damian was set to meet. He thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. Damian did not look up from his desk when Arthur entered. He simply slid the glass box across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. "Find her," Damian said, his voice flat. Arthur peered at the single dried leaf. "Sir, find who?" "The woman from the elevator." Arthur's composure flickered for a fraction of a second. The entire company had been buzzing about the CEO being trapped during the blackout, but no one knew the details. "Of course, sir. Do you have a name or the department she works in?" "No," Damian said, his gaze still fixed on the leaf. "I have that." Arthur blinked. "The leaf, sir. It came from her. She had a scent. Lavender chamomile. And that." He gestured toward the box. Her voice was calm. "She told a story about a boy and a star." Arthur stood in stunned silence, processing the most impossible directive of his career. He was to conduct a corporate-wide manhunt for an unknown woman based on a piece of foliage and a bedtime story. "I need a list of every female employee who was in the building after 5 p.m. On the day of the storm, Damian continued his tone, leaving no room for argument. "Cross-reference it with security footage from the elevator banks. I want to know who she is." "Sir, the power was out. The primary security cameras were down. We'll only have the entry and exit logs from the lobby turnstiles," Arthur explained gently. "That's over 1,000 women." Damian finally looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. "Then you had better get started, Arthur." For Elara, the incident in the elevator was a fever dream she was desperate to forget. The days that followed were a blur of shame and confusion. She had been touched by the city's most untouchable man, and had seen a vulnerability in him she was certain no one else had. The memory felt dangerous, a secret she was an unwilling accomplice to. She threw herself into her work with a renewed, frantic energy, hoping to bury the memory under the sheer weight of routine. But 2 weeks later, a new, more terrifying anxiety began to bloom within her. It started with a subtle weariness that settled deep in her bones, a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. Then came the waves of nausea that ambushed her in the morning, leaving her dizzy and pale. She blamed it on stress, on poor nutrition, on the sheer exhaustion of her life. But when she found herself nearly fainting while lifting a heavy tray of dishes, the terrible, impossible suspicion took root. That evening, she sat on the edge of the chipped porcelain bathtub in her tiny apartment, the city lights a distant, indifferent glitter outside her window. 3 home pregnancy tests were lined up on the sink. All of them screamed the same life-altering truth: pregnant. A wave of cold dread washed over her, so intense it left her breathless. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. One moment, one single desperate, anonymous moment in the dark. She dropped her head into her hands, a single choked sob escaping her lips. How could she do this? She was alone, barely making enough to cover her own rent. The father was a ghost, a powerful, damaged man who lived in a different universe, a man who wouldn't even know her face if he saw her again. And then she saw the detail she had overlooked in her initial shock. The box for the most expensive, most accurate test had a small celebratory starburst printed on the side. Results in 1 minute. Over 99% accurate. Now predicts number of weeks and potential multiples. Her eyes scanned the tiny digital screen again. It read, pregnant. 3+ weeks. And next to it a symbol she didn't understand. She snatched the instruction pamphlet with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the fine print until she found the corresponding chart. The symbol meant one thing: high likelihood of multiple gestation. Triplets. The word didn't even seem real. It was a joke. A cruel, cosmic joke. The room began to spin, and she gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. But then something else stirred. Deep beneath the terror, a fierce primal instinct ignited. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. Her children. They were real. They were hers. And they were utterly, terrifyingly helpless. In that moment, the fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a ferocious resolve. She didn't know how, but she would protect them. She would find a way. Her new fragile determination was tested 3 days later. She was walking home from her late shift, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. A car slowed beside her, its engine a low growl. The passenger window slid down. Elara Markham's voice slithered into the night air. She flinched, her steps quickening. "Leave me alone, Markham." The car kept pace with her. "Now is that any way to talk to your husband?" "Ex-husband," she corrected, not looking at him. "The papers are signed. It's over." He laughed, a humorless grating sound. "It's never over. You think a piece of paper erases 10 years you owe me, Elara. You wasted the best years of my life." Finally, she stopped and turned to face him. His face was illuminated by the dashboard light, his eyes possessive, his smile a thin, cruel line. He hadn't changed. He was still the man who saw her not as a person, but as a possession that had malfunctioned. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I worked 2 jobs to support us while you gambled away our savings. I cooked, I cleaned, I made myself small to make you feel big. I paid for those 10 years with my own happiness. I'm done paying." His smile vanished. "You've gotten bold since you moved to the big city. Think you're better than me now." He opened the car door. "Get in. We're going to talk about this." "No. Get in the car, Elara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. It was the same tone he used right before he would punch a wall or throw a plate. Panic flared in her chest, but it was quickly eclipsed by the image of the 3 tiny lives she was now carrying. She stood her ground. "You have no right to tell me what to do anymore. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." For a long moment he just stared at her, his eyes burning with a possessive rage. She could see the internal struggle, the desire to drag her into the car, warring with the inconvenience of a police report. Finally, he slammed the car door shut. "This isn't over," he hissed through the open window. "You belong to me, you'll see." He sped off, his tires screeching on the wet asphalt. Elara stood trembling on the sidewalk, wrapping her arms around her stomach. The threat wasn't just to her anymore. Markham didn't know it, but he was now a danger to her children. She was trapped. Trapped between a past that wouldn't let her go, and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, with the father of her children, a powerful, unknowable phantom, who was at that very moment hunting for her with nothing more than a single dried leaf. The Blackwood ancestral estate was a creature of a different era. Unlike Damian's sterile penthouse, which rejected the past, the estate was steeped in it. It was a sprawling stone manor set amidst acres of ancient oaks and manicured gardens, a place where history was not just remembered, but inhaled with every breath of air. The walls were lined with the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their oil-painted eyes following Damian's every move, judging, waiting. It was the one place on Earth where he was not the master of his own fortress, but a temporary custodian of a legacy that felt more like a tomb. And its warden was his grandmother. Matilda Blackwood was as formidable as the house she commanded. At 80 years old, she possessed a spine of forged steel and a mind as sharp as a shard of ice. She moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of a queen, her silver hair coiled in an elegant chignon, her presence filling any room she entered. She was the only person in the world who was not afraid of Damian. She found him in the library, a cavernous room paneled in dark, fragrant cedar and filled with thousands of leather-bound books that no one had read in decades. He was staring out the leaded glass window at the rain-swept grounds, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. "You're avoiding me," Matilda said. It wasn't a question. Damian didn't turn. "I'm busy, grandmother." "You are hiding," she corrected, her voice calm but unyielding. She came to stand beside him, her reflection, a pale, elegant ghost, next to his dark, rigid form in the glass. "You are 32 years old, Damian. Your father was married with a child on the way at 25. This family, this name has survived wars, depressions, and scandals. I will not allow it to be extinguished by silence." "There is nothing to discuss," he said, his voice tight. "Isn't there?" Her gaze was piercing. "You have built an empire greater than any of your forefathers could have imagined. But you are a king without a kingdom, ruling from an empty castle in the sky. You have no heir. You have no partner. You have this condition. This wall you have built around yourself." A muscle twitched in Damian's jaw. "Do not call it a condition. What would you have me call it?" She pressed, her voice softening slightly, a rare crack in her iron facade. "A preference, a quirk. I saw you at the charity benefit last month. A woman stumbled near you and you recoiled as if she were on fire. The world whispers, Damian. They call you eccentric. Soon they will call you unstable. I don't care what they call me, he bit out, finally turning to face her. His eyes were cold fire. This conversation is over. No, Matilda said, her voice rising to match his intensity. It is not. I held you in my arms the day you were born. I held you at your parents' funeral. I have watched you build these walls brick by brick, and I have held my tongue. But my silence ends now. You are the last of our line. You will not let the Blackwood name die with you. You will find a wife. You will produce an heir. Or you will watch everything you've built crumble to dust when you are gone. Her words struck him like a physical blow, not because of the ultimatum, but because they dragged the ghost he fought every day out into the light. The library, with its scent of old paper and wood smoke, dissolved around him, and he was once again a small boy, trapped in the crushing metallic darkness. The world was upside down. The smell of rain on hot asphalt filled his nose, thick and cloying, mixed with something sharp and coppery. He could hear a strange, rhythmic ticking sound, and the high, thin sound of his own whimpering. His legs were pinned, a heavy, unyielding weight pressing down on his thighs. He tried to call for his mother, but the word was a dry rasp in his throat. Through the shattered windshield, he could see the flashing lights, red and blue, painting the rain-streaked trees in frantic, nightmarish strokes. He was so cold. His father in the driver's seat beside him was unnaturally still, his head lolled at an impossible angle. His mother in the back. He couldn't turn to see her, but he knew. The silence where her laughter should have been was the loudest sound in the world. Then a face appeared at his window, framed by jagged shards of glass. It was a woman. Her hair was soaked, plastered to her forehead, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pity. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. "We're going to get you out." Her hand, warm and smelling faintly of cigarettes and mints, reached through the broken window and closed around his arm. Her touch was meant to be reassuring, a lifeline. But for Damian, it was an alien intrusion into his bubble of shock. As she began to pull her grip firm, another sound cut through the night, the high-pitched squeal of tires failing to find purchase on the wet road. He saw the headlights, bright and blinding, coming straight for them. The woman's eyes widened in sheer terror. Her grip on his arm tightened, a convulsive, panicked clench. There was a terrible, deafening crunch of metal on metal. The woman was thrown sideways, her scream cut short, her body slamming against the side of their wrecked car. Her hand was ripped from his arm, but not before he felt the sharp, searing pain of her nails digging into his skin as the impact hit. The last thing he remembered before the world faded to black was the sight of her lying broken on the pavement, and the agonizing sensation of her touch, a touch that had promised rescue, but had delivered only more horror, more pain, more loss. Damian. His grandmother's voice pulled him back to the present. He was breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The library was silent. The ghosts momentarily vanished, but their chill remained. "I am handling it," he said, his voice a low growl. He turned back to the window, the conversation and his obligations definitively over. Matilda watched him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of sorrow and frustration, before turning and leaving him alone with the ghosts in his gilded cage. Elara's world had shrunk to the four walls of her small bathroom. For the past 3 weeks, her body had been in open rebellion. The fatigue was a leaden cloak she couldn't shrug off, and the morning sickness was a relentless tyrant. With Triplets, her doctor had explained with a sympathetic smile, every symptom was amplified. It felt less like an amplification and more like a hostile takeover. Her job, once just a monotonous means to an end, had become a daily high-stakes performance. She had to smile at customers while her stomach churned. She had to lift heavy trays of dishes when her arms felt like they were made of wet sand. She had to pretend to be fine, normal, invisible, when all she wanted to do was curl up and sleep for a year. Losing this job was not an option. It was the only thing standing between her and utter destitution. The lunch rush was her personal battlefield. The noise, the smells, the controlled chaos, it was an assault on her heightened senses. Today was particularly bad. The clatter of plates was like hammers against her skull. The smell of the beef stew special was a thick, gag-inducing miasma. She was scooping macaroni and cheese onto a plate when the wave hit. It started with a cold sweat on her forehead, followed by a dizzying lurch as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The fluorescent lights above her began to pulse their hum, growing into a roar inside her head. "Don't faint," she told herself, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter. Not here. Not now. Are you okay, Elara? It was Maria, an older woman who worked the grill, her face etched with concern. Fine, Elara managed to whisper, forcing a pale smile. Just didn't sleep well. She knew she couldn't stay on the line. She needed to escape. Excusing herself, she moved on unsteady legs toward the back, heading for the cavernous walk-in pantry. It was the only place she could be alone for a few moments. She stumbled inside the cool, dark air, a blessed relief. Leaning against a 10-gallon drum of olive oil, she closed her eyes and took deep, shuddering breaths, trying to will the world to stop spinning. The scent of dry pasta spices and industrial-sized cans of tomatoes filled her nose. It was better than the beef stew. She slid down the wall, her back against the cool metal shelves, and rested her head on her knees. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. How long could she keep this up? How long until her body betrayed her secret completely? The pantry door creaked open. Elara's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Mr. Henderson, the cafeteria's general manager, stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was a stern but fair man, a stickler for rules and efficiency. Seeing her huddled on the floor was a serious breach of protocol. Vance, he said, his voice low. What's going on? I'm sorry, sir, she said, scrambling to her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment. I just felt a little dizzy. I needed a minute. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her pale face and the slight tremor in her hands. She braced herself for the inevitable reprimand, the formal write-up, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Maria said, you looked unwell. There's a stomach bug going around. He wasn't asking. He was offering her an excuse, a life raft. Relief so potent it almost made her weep washed over her. Yes, sir. I think that might be it. Go home, Vance, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Take the rest of the day. But I need you back here at 100% tomorrow. We're already short-staffed. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, she whispered, grabbing her bag and hurrying past him, not daring to meet his eyes, terrified he might see the truth she was so desperately trying to hide. As she fled the building, the manager's kindness felt less like a comfort and more like a ticking clock. She had survived today, but tomorrow and the day after that, the silent battle would continue. She was a woman trapped by her own body, her future dependent on a secret that grew more impossible to keep with each passing day. Miles away in his silent library, Damian Blackwood was a man trapped by his own mind, his future dependent on a legacy he didn't know how to continue. Both were prisoners of their own past, completely unaware that their paths were destined to collide once more. Arthur Pendleton's office was the meticulous, hyper-organized brain of Damian Blackwood's empire. From this command center, he managed schedules, vetted acquisitions, and neutralized threats with quiet digital efficiency. But for the past month, his office had transformed into something else entirely, a botanical and criminological research lab, dedicated to a single, infuriatingly vague mystery. The clary sage leaf, now professionally preserved, sat under a magnifying lamp on his desk. He had become an amateur botanist, cross-referencing horticultural databases and consulting with 3 different university botany departments. He knew its species, its origin, and its typical uses in aromatherapy. He knew everything about the leaf, but nothing about the woman who had dropped it. The personnel files were a mountain of digital paper. 1,112 female employees had swiped their badges to exit the building on the day of the storm. He had spent weeks poring over the grainy, low-resolution images from the lobby, turnstiles a parade of blurry faces and indistinct forms. He had flagged 200 possibilities, then narrowed it down to 50, then 20. He cross-referenced their work schedules, their departments, even their employee satisfaction surveys, searching for any data point that might correlate with a calm demeanor or a knowledge of herbal remedies. It was a search for a ghost in the machine, and he was failing. The intercom on his desk crackled to life, Damian's voice cutting through the silence devoid of any preamble. Report. Arthur straightened his tie, a purely reflexive gesture. Sir, I have narrowed the list of potential employees to 12 individuals. However, without a visual confirmation or any further data, I am at an impasse. A long, tense silence stretched over the line. Arthur could picture Damian in his penthouse staring out at the city, his impatience a palpable force even through the electronic speaker. The scent Arthur Damian's voice was low-laced with frustration. The story. These are the markers. An employee file does not contain a person's soul. Dig deeper. The line went dead. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. Dig deeper. It was like being asked to excavate the ocean floor with a teaspoon. He was a man of logic and facts, and he had been tasked with solving a puzzle of scent and memory. His work was interrupted by a flashing alert on his screen, a priority notification from their market intelligence division. He clicked it open, and his blood ran cold. Sterling Industries, their most aggressive competitor, had just completed a hostile acquisition of a key microchip supplier in Taiwan, effectively cornering the market on a component essential to Blackwood's next-generation technology. It was a brilliant, devastatingly effective move, and it had been executed with the kind of surgical precision that spoke of insider knowledge. Arthur's fingers flew across the keyboard. This wasn't just business. It was a declaration of war. And he knew who was holding the sword. Isabel Sterling looked out from her corner office, which offered a panoramic view of the city that directly challenged Damian Blackwood's. Her world, like his, was one of sharp angles and cool, modern aesthetics, but where his was sterile, hers was sensual. A single perfect orchid sat on her desk. A bold, abstract painting adorned the wall. She was a woman who appreciated beauty, but valued power above all else. She swirled the amber liquid in her glass, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. He won't know what hit him. She murmured to her subordinate, a nervous young man who was watching the stock ticker on his tablet with wide eyes. The board at Blackwood will panic, he said, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. This move cuts their production forecast by 30%. Panic is the point, Isabel said, her voice smooth as silk. Damian only operates from a position of absolute strength. He is a fortress, but even the strongest fortresses have cracks. You just need to know where to apply the pressure. She took a delicate sip of her drink. He has a famous aversion to complications, to human messiness. We have just presented him with a very messy complication. Her subordinate nodded, still looking at the plummeting Blackwood stock price. What's our next move? Isabel turned from the window, her eyes glittering with predatory amusement. Our next move is a personal one. She turned to her assistant. Get me Damian Blackwood on the line. Tell him an old friend wants to have lunch to discuss a matter of mutual interest. She knew he would refuse a formal business meeting, but a personal appeal cloaked in the guise of their shared privileged childhood might just pique his curiosity, or at least his arrogance. She would use their history as a key to unlock his fortress to get close enough to see the cracks for herself. Elara had learned to live with the constant low-grade hum of nausea and the bone-deep fatigue. Her secret was a living thing inside her, and she had become an expert at shielding it from the world. Crackers in her apron pocket became her constant companions. She learned the art of the feigned yawn to hide her exhaustion. Her uniform, once loose, was now strategically bloused to hide the subtle but definite changes in her body. She was more than a survivor. She was an artist of camouflage. Mr. Henderson, the manager, had been watching her. He hadn't forgotten the day she nearly collapsed. But he also hadn't forgotten the flash of talent he'd seen. He noticed the way she would instinctively adjust the seasoning in a batch of soup when the head cook wasn't looking, a pinch of salt here, a dash of paprika there, transforming the mundane into something memorable. He saw the small, worn notebook she kept filled, not with idle doodles, but with intricate sketches of plated dishes and complex notes on flavor pairings. He had been a chef, once a good one, before the long hours and brutal pressure had driven him into the relative sanity of management. He recognized the spark in her, the quiet, fierce passion of a true creator. He found her during her break, sitting in a quiet corner of the deserted cafeteria, sketching in her notebook. Vance, he said, his voice softer than usual. She snapped the notebook shut, her face flushing as if caught doing something illicit. Mr. Henderson. He pulled up a chair and sat opposite her, a rare gesture of equality. I was head chef at the Savoy for 5 years before I took this job. Elara's eyes widened slightly. The Savoy was one of the city's most celebrated restaurants. I know what it looks like when someone has the gift, he continued, his gaze steady. And I know what it looks like when that gift is being wasted on scooping tuna salad. Elara looked down at her hands, her throat tight. It's just a job, sir. It pays the bills. It's a waste, he said bluntly. Listen, I have a small private luncheon next week. Just 3 board members visiting from the London office. It's not on the official cafeteria schedule. The budget is small, but the palates are sophisticated. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. I want you to handle it. The menu, the preparation, the plating, everything. Consider it an audition. Show me that the artist I see in this notebook is real." A jolt of pure, unadulterated hope so strong it was almost painful shot through Elara. It was a chance. A terrifying, exhilarating, impossible chance. But the head cook will be conveniently busy with inventory, Henderson said with a slight smile. "This is off the books. It's between you and me. Don't make me regret this, Vance." For the first time in months, Elara felt a fire ignite in her soul. The exhaustion, the nausea, the constant hum of anxiety had all receded, replaced by a surge of creative energy. The day of the luncheon, the small executive kitchen became her sanctuary. She moved with a purpose and precision that had been dormant for too long. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. She seared scallops until they were perfectly caramelized, their sweetness balanced by a tart citrus reduction. She crafted a delicate, vibrant risotto, each grain of rice perfectly cooked, infused with saffron, and a subtle, almost imperceptible hint of her signature herb, clary sage. It was a risk using such a unique flavor, but it was her flavor. She plated each dish with the focus of a surgeon and the eye of a painter. When the plates were carried out to the small dining room, she didn't feel nervous. She felt alive. From the kitchen doorway, she watched as the 3 British board members, all notoriously difficult to please, took their first bites. She saw the flicker of surprise in their eyes, the subtle nod of appreciation. She saw them murmur to each other, gesturing toward their plates with their forks. Mr. Henderson stood beside her. His arms crossed, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "I knew it," he whispered more to himself than to her. "I knew I wasn't wrong about you." In that moment, Elara Vance was not a cafeteria worker. She was not a struggling divorcee or a frightened pregnant woman. She was a chef. And in the quiet, appreciative murmurs of 3 powerful men, she heard the first faint whisper of a future she had thought was lost to her forever. She had won a small, crucial battle, completely unaware that outside the walls of her kitchen, a far more dangerous war was being declared on the man whose children she was secretly carrying. The Blackwood Enterprises annual gala was not a party. It was a performance. It was a carefully orchestrated display of power, wealth, and unwavering stability, designed to reassure investors and intimidate rivals. This year, the performance was more critical than ever. The ripples from Isabel Sterling's corporate raid were still unsettling the market, and every guest in the glittering ballroom was watching Damian Blackwood for the slightest hint of a crack in his armor. The ballroom was a symphony of crystal and starlight, the chandeliers dripping diamonds of light onto a sea of tailored tuxedos and couture gowns. Elara, dressed in the stark white uniform of the catering staff, felt like a ghost haunting a royal ball. She moved through the whirlwind of power and privilege, her tray of delicate canapes held high, her senses overwhelmed. Just a month ago, her universe had been the beige landscape of the cafeteria. Now she was surrounded by the scent of expensive perfume, the murmur of powerful conversations, and the dazzling flash of real jewels. Mr. Henderson had personally requested her for the event, a promotion that felt both like a reward and a terrifying test. He caught her eye from across the room and gave her a subtle, encouraging nod. She was a world away from scooping macaroni and cheese, and the exhilarating fear of it was a current buzzing under her skin. She saw Damian moving through the crowd, a magnetic North Pole around which all others oriented themselves. He was the perfect host, his smile a cool, polite slash, his handshake brief and sterile. He radiated a formidable calm, but Elara, who had seen the terrified man curled on the floor of a dark elevator, knew it was a meticulously constructed facade. Her gaze drifted and landed on a woman in a stunning blood-red gown that clung to her like a second skin. Her beauty was sharp and intelligent, her smile predatory. She was talking to a senator, but her eyes were fixed on Damian. Elara didn't need an introduction to know this was Isabel Sterling. She watched as Isabel intercepted Damian, her hand hovering near his arm, but never touching, a calculated gesture of intimacy and threat. Damian's polite smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. A silent, vicious battle was being waged under the glittering chandeliers, and Elara was an invisible witness. The real war, however, was about to erupt in the kitchen. The first 2 courses had been executed with military precision. But as the staff prepared for the main course, pan-seared halibut with a saffron truffle beurre blanc, a wave of panic rippled out from the head chef's station. Chef Antoine, a man with a Michelin star ego and a temper to match, was staring into a large pot, his face a mask of horror. "It's split." He whispered the words barely audible over the clatter of the kitchen. "The sauce. It's broken." A sous chef rushed over. "We can save it, chef. A little heat, an egg yolk." "It's dead!" Antoine roared, slamming his whisk onto the counter. The delicate emulsion had separated into a greasy, curdled mess. With 200 plates needing to go out in 10 minutes, it was an unmitigated disaster. The chef's carefully constructed composure shattered. He began shouting, his French accent thickening as he cursed his staff, the ovens, the gods of cuisine. The kitchen devolved into chaos, the high-pressure environment imploding under the weight of its leader's failure. Elara watched from her station, her heart pounding. This was the moment that would define the night, the moment that would be whispered about for years, the Blackwood Gala where the sauce broke. But as she looked at the panicked faces and the screaming chef, she didn't see disaster. She saw ingredients. She saw possibilities. The halibut was useless now without its sauce, but there were crates of beautiful organic Poussin young chickens prepped for the staff meal. There were fresh herbs, wild mushrooms, and a reserve of excellent chicken stock. While Chef Antoine was throwing a tantrum, Elara began to move. There was no time for permission. She grabbed a large sauté pan, her movements swift and certain. The other line cooks, leaderless and desperate, watched her, their eyes wide. "Give me the Poussin," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that cut through the chaos. "You get me the thyme and the wild mushrooms. And I need a bottle of the dry Marsala wine now." Perhaps it was her confidence, or perhaps they were simply out of other options, but they obeyed. The kitchen, which had been a cacophony of panic, was now filled with the sound of her focused rhythmic work. The sizzle of chicken skin hitting a hot pan. The sharp, clean chop of her knife moving through mushrooms. The fragrant hiss as she deglazed the pan with wine. She worked with the fluid grace of a master, her fear burned away by the pure, hot flame of creation. She was not Elara Vance, the cafeteria worker. She was a chef in her element, and she was saving the night. In the ballroom, Damian tasted the main course. The fish had been replaced by a small, perfectly roasted Poussin, its skin impossibly crisp, the meat tender and juicy. It rested on a bed of earthy wild mushrooms and the sauce. The sauce was a revelation. It was rich, complex, and infused with a haunting, fragrant herb that he recognized with a visceral jolt. Lavender, chamomile, and that. It was the scent from the darkness, the scent of calm. He dropped his fork, the clatter loud in the relative quiet of his table. His polite facade crumbled, replaced by a look of stark, raw astonishment. He stood up abruptly, ignoring the surprised looks of his guests, and strode with purpose toward the kitchen doors. He burst through them to find a scene of controlled buzzing activity. Chef Antoine was standing off to the side, looking pale and useless. In the center of it all was a woman in a simple white uniform, a smudge of sauce on her cheek, directing the plating of the last dishes with a quiet, confident command. "Who made this?" Damian's voice was a low growl that cut through the kitchen's noise. Every head turned. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his face beaming with a pride so intense it was almost parental. "She did, sir. Elara Vance. She saved us." Damian's icy gaze locked onto Elara. He didn't see a chef. He didn't see a hero. He saw the answer to the mystery that had been haunting him for months. "You," he said, the single word hanging in the air. "My office. Now." He turned and swept out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She followed him on trembling legs down a short corridor and into a small, quiet office away from the noise of the gala. He closed the door behind them. The room was silent. He just stared at her, his eyes searching her face, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the memory of a soothing voice in the dark. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small glass box. He opened it and tipped the single dried clary sage leaf into his palm. "This was you," he stated, his voice tight with a strange, unreadable emotion. "In the elevator." The secret was too heavy to hold any longer. Elara looked at the leaf in his hand, then met his intense gaze. Her own voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, it was me." 1,000 unspoken questions hung between them. His expression was a storm of confusion, disbelief, and something else she couldn't name. He took a step closer, his sterile bubble of personal space forgotten. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the office door was thrown open with a crash. Markham stood there, swaying slightly, his tie askew, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, found Elara instantly. "There you are!" he snarled, stumbling into the room. Security guards were right behind him, but he was already moving, his focus locked on her. "I knew I'd find you slithering around with the rich folk." "Markham, get out," Elara said, her voice shaking. "Get out," he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'm just getting started." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You think you can just leave me and climb into a better life? You think you're too good for me now." Damian moved his body, reacting before his mind could process. A protective instinct he didn't know he possessed surged through him. "Take your hand off her." Markham's crazed eyes shifted to Damian, a sneer twisting his lips. "And who are you?" "Her new billionaire boyfriend. Did she tell you all about me? Did she tell you how she wasted 10 years of my life?" The commotion had drawn a small crowd to the doorway. Guests peered in their faces, a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The performance was unraveling. Markham tightened his grip on Elara, shaking her slightly. "You left me for this. For him." His gaze dropped, a new venomous realization dawning in his drunken mind. He stared at her stomach, at the way her chef's whites couldn't completely conceal the gentle curve that had begun to form there. "You lying!" He began, his voice dropping to a hiss. Then he threw his head back and roared, his voice echoing through the now silent gala. "You want to know a secret about my perfect little wife?" He flung a hand out, pointing a trembling finger at Elara's abdomen for the entire world to see. "Why don't you ask her who she's carrying? Whose babies are in her belly?" The word hung in the air, a grenade that had just been detonated. Babies. Plural. The murmur of the crowd died. Isabel Sterling stood at the edge of the crowd, a look of triumphant shock on her beautiful face. Markham's drunken, slurred accusation had done more damage than her corporate raid ever could. Damian's gaze dropped from Markham's hate-filled face to Elara's. He saw the terror in her eyes, the shame, and the undeniable truth. Then his eyes moved lower to her stomach, and for the first time he truly saw it. The gentle, impossible curve. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ghost from the elevator, the brilliant chef from his kitchen, was pregnant. With his children. The fortress of his control didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and light. Markham's final venomous words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the ballroom, followed by an explosive eruption of gasps and frantic whispers. Cameras flashed the strobing lights of smartphones, creating a brutal, stuttering tableau of the scene, Elara pale and frozen in shock, Markham a sneering, drunken mess, and Damian a statue carved from ice in the eye of the hurricane. For a single suspended heartbeat, Damian's world fractured. The revelation babies was an aftershock that threatened to bring his entire fortress crashing down. But years of conditioning, of burying emotion beneath layers of cold, hard control took over. His face remained an unreadable mask. He moved with chilling speed. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Elara. His glacial gaze fixed on the head of his security detail. "Remove him." Damian's voice was not loud, but it cut through the din with the authority of a death sentence. "And make sure he is never within 500 feet of this building, or Ms. Vance again. Am I understood?" The guards swarmed Markham, who struggled for a moment before his drunken rage dissolved into pathetic whimpering as he was efficiently and silently neutralized. Damian then turned his attention to Arthur, who had appeared at his side as if summoned by sheer force of will. "The gala is over," Damian said, his tone absolute. "Have our guests escorted out. Kill the music. I want this room empty in 5 minutes." Arthur simply nodded and began issuing quiet, firm commands into his earpiece. The performance was officially over. Damian finally turned to Elara. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself in a desperate attempt to hold her shattered world together. He did not touch her, his body still recoiled from the very idea, but he moved to stand slightly in front of her, shielding her from the hundreds of prying, hungry eyes. "We are leaving," he said softly, his words for her alone. He led her through a private service corridor away from the gawking crowd, his presence a silent, intimidating shield. The walk was a blur of polished floors and hushed, echoing footsteps. They took his private elevator directly to the penthouse, the ascent, a swift, silent journey into the sky, the tension inside the small cabin thick enough to choke on. When the elevator doors opened into the vast, sterile silence of his apartment, the facade of control he had maintained finally began to fray. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the raw, staggering reality of the situation. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, and stared out at the glittering, indifferent city below. The silence stretched thin and brittle. Elara stood rooted to the spot just inside the door, feeling small and exposed in the enormous, soulless room. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained the reflection of his face, a pale mask in the dark glass. Is it true? There was no point in lying. There was no room left for secrets. Yes, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He turned slowly to face her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. You are pregnant. She nodded, unable to speak. And you were going to tell me when exactly? The question was laced with a cold, cutting anger, the first real emotion he had shown. I didn't know how, she said, finding her voice a spark of defiance kindling within her. What was I supposed to do? Leave a note with your coffee order. By the way, I'm the woman you met in the dark, and I'm carrying your children. You don't even know my name. The truth of her words seemed to deflate his anger, replacing it with a disoriented confusion. He ran a hand through his perfect hair, disrupting it for the first time. Babies. He said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He said, babies. Plural. Triplets, she confirmed the word, dropping into the silence like a stone. Damian actually staggered back a step, his hand bracing against the back of a severe leather sofa. Triplets. The word was an absurdity, a statistical impossibility. His mind, which operated on logic and predictable outcomes, could not process it. A single accidental encounter, a woman whose face he couldn't even remember. And now, 3 children, 3 heirs. He began to pace, his movements tight and agitated, a caged animal in his own minimalist zoo. The implications crashed down on him in waves. His grandmother's relentless pressure, the future of the Blackwood dynasty, the end of his carefully curated isolation. This woman, this stranger, had breached his fortress in the most absolute and permanent way possible. His phobia, the deep-seated terror of intimacy and connection, screamed at him to run, to reject it all, to pay her off and send her away. But another instinct, something ancient and dynastic, was stirring. An heir, a bloodline, a legacy. He who had resigned himself to being the last of his line, the end point of a powerful family, was suddenly faced with a continuation he had never thought possible. And beneath all of that, a new and unsettling feeling, a fierce primal surge of protectiveness for the woman standing before him and the impossibly fragile lives she carried. He had seen Markham grab her, had seen the terror in her eyes, and something within him had snapped. He stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on her. His decision, when it came, was swift, logical, and stripped of all emotion. It was the only way he could process it. This is a complex problem, he began, his voice once again the flat, controlled tone of a CEO. It requires a practical solution. He laid out the terms as if he were negotiating a merger. You are in danger. Your ex-husband is unstable. The media, once they catch this story, will descend like vultures. You cannot protect yourself or them alone. He took a breath. I am offering you an arrangement. There is a private bungalow on the far side of the estate grounds. It is secure, secluded, with its own staff. You will move there immediately. You will be provided with a full-time security detail and the best medical team in the country. All of your financial needs and those of your family, if necessary, will be met. Your ex-husband will be dealt with through legal channels swiftly and permanently. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. In return, you will carry the children to term. They will be given the Blackwood name. They will be raised here as my heirs. He delivered the final crucial line, a shield for them both against the terrifying intimacy of it all. This is a contract, Ms. Vance. It is a business arrangement to ensure the well-being and security of the Blackwood heirs. It is not personal. Elara listened, her initial terror slowly being replaced by a cold, clear-eyed fury. A business arrangement. An incubator. A vessel for the Blackwood heirs. Her pride, the fierce independence that had been her only real possession, screamed at her to refuse. To walk out that door and never look back, to raise her children on her own in poverty if she must, but free. But then the image of Markham's twisted, enraged face flashed in her mind. She thought of trying to work while carrying triplets, of being hounded by reporters, of the sheer crushing impossibility of providing for 3 children on a cafeteria worker's salary. She thought of their future, of the opportunities they would have as Blackwoods versus the life of struggle she could offer them. Her maternal instinct, that ferocious, selfless love that had bloomed the moment she saw the positive test, was at war with her own pride. And the mother won. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without flinching. I accept your arrangement, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "But I have terms of my own." Damian's eyebrows rose, a flicker of surprise in his icy eyes. "This is for their safety and their future," she continued. "But they are my children and I will be their mother, not just a surrogate. I will not be a prisoner in your gilded cage. I will have autonomy over my own life, and I will have a say in theirs. They will know me, they will know my love, and they will know that I am more than just a clause in a contract." A long moment passed as he assessed her. He saw not a frightened employee, but a woman of unexpected strength, a lioness protecting her cubs. It was the same quality he had heard in her voice in the darkness of the elevator. Calm, but unbreakable. "Agreed," he said with a single decisive nod. The fragile alliance was forged. Hours later at the Blackwood estate, Matilda sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, a cashmere throw over her lap, reading a biography of Catherine the Great. Arthur was announced, his face pale, and his posture unusually tense. He delivered the news succinctly, clinically, leaving out the most intimate details, but providing the core explosive facts: the incident in the elevator, the gala, the public revelation, the triplets, the arrangement. Matilda listened without interruption, her face impassive. When he finished, she did not speak for a full minute. She simply closed her book, her finger marking her page, and stared into the fire. Arthur braced himself for an eruption of aristocratic fury. Instead, when she finally turned to him, a slow, calculating, and utterly triumphant smile spread across her face. "A scandal," she said, her voice a low purr, "is temporary. A bloodline is eternal." She saw past the messy public humiliation to the glorious, miraculous result. The Blackwood line would not die. She rose from her chair, her movements energized, her eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "Prepare the Rosewood bungalow at once. I want it fully staffed and secured by morning. Inform the medical team at St. Vincent's that they are now on retainer. And Arthur," she paused, her voice taking on the unmistakable ring of command, "you will ensure that Ms. Vance is treated not as an employee, not as a guest, but as the single most valuable asset this family now possesses. The future of this house is inside her. The Queen had her heir, and she would protect the mother at all costs." The news of Elara Vance's new residence at the Blackwood estate spread through the city's elite circles like a virus. It was a subject of fevered, whispered speculation at every charity luncheon and exclusive country club. To most, she was a faceless gold digger, a cunning nobody who had somehow ensnared the city's most elusive billionaire. To Isabel Sterling, she was a declaration of war. Isabel sat in her office, a single sheet of paper from her private investigator's report on the desk before her. It detailed Elara's move to the Rosewood bungalow, the installation of a state-of-the-art security system, and the hiring of a top-tier prenatal medical team. Each detail was a nail in the coffin of her own ambitions. Her plan had always been predicated on Damian's weakness, on his isolation. She understood his trauma better than anyone, and she had intended to use it as a scalpel to carve up his empire. An unstable, isolated Damian was a man who might eventually, in a moment of crisis, be convinced that a merger with a friend like her was his only path to stability. But this changed the entire equation. The maid, the cafeteria worker, was not just a fleeting dalliance. The pregnancy, the triplets, had provided Damian with the one thing he had always lacked and secretly craved: a legacy. An heir gave him a reason to fight, a reason to strengthen his walls rather than seek shelter within hers. Elara Vance, by her very existence, was making Damian stronger. She was not a complication. She was a cure. And that made her an unacceptable threat. Isabel's face was a mask of cold fury. She had underestimated the situation. She had thought the public humiliation at the gala would be enough to drive a wedge between them. But she had failed to account for Damian's dynastic programming and the girl's apparent resilience. "It seems a more direct approach is required," she said to the empty room. She picked up her phone and dialed her investigator. "I need everything you have on her ex-husband. Markham. His debts, his vices, his weaknesses. Find me a lever." Her voice was like chipping ice. "Every broken man has a price." Markham was nursing a cheap beer in a dive bar, the stench of stale smoke and regret clinging to his clothes. He was a man adrift. The incident at the gala had gotten him fired from his job and made him a minor pathetic celebrity amongst his peers. He was furious, humiliated, and most of all, impotent. Elara, the timid, compliant woman he had once controlled, had slipped through his fingers and landed in a world he couldn't even imagine. A sleek black car pulled up outside the bar. A man in a tailored suit got out and entered, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Markham. "Mr. Markham," the man said, his voice polite but firm, "my employer would like a word with you." 20 minutes later, Markham was sitting in a private, soundproofed room in a downtown luxury hotel. The opulence was nauseating. Across the table sat Isabel Sterling, looking like she had been carved from marble and money. She smelled of victory. "Mr. Markham," she began, her voice a low, melodious purr, "I understand you find yourself in a disadvantageous position." Markham scowled. "If you're here to laugh at me—" "On the contrary," Isabel said, smiling. "I'm here to offer you an opportunity. We have a mutual interest, you and I. We both believe that Elara Vance does not belong in Damian Blackwood's world. We both believe she is out of her depth." She slid a sleek black credit card across the polished table. "This has a limit of $100,000. It is a retainer for your services." Markham stared at the card as if it were a venomous snake. "What services?" "I want you to convince Elara to leave," Isabel said, her eyes glittering. "You know her better than anyone. You know her fears, her pressure points. I want you to apply that pressure. Make her life uncomfortable. Make her feel that the walls of the Blackwood estate are not a fortress, but a cage. Make her feel so unsafe, so hounded, that her only option is to run." "Blackwood's security will crush me," Markham said, a flicker of his old cowardice showing. "They can't crush a ghost," Isabel replied smoothly. "I don't want you to break down the door. I want you to seep through the cracks. Anonymous online posts, messages to her old acquaintances, reminders that the past is never truly gone." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want you to be the ghost that haunts her new perfect life. I am not asking you to harm her physically. That would be crude, and it would trace back to you. I want you to break her spirit." Markham picked up the credit card. The feel of its cool, heavy plastic in his hand was intoxicating. It was power. It was revenge. It was everything he had lost. "What's the first step?" he asked, a greedy, vicious light in his eyes. Isabel's smile was triumphant. "We begin by reminding her that no wall is high enough to keep out the entire world." Life in the Rosewood bungalow was a strange, surreal dream. The small, elegant house was a world unto itself, nestled in a secluded corner of the estate, surrounded by a riot of fragrant rose bushes. Elara had her own staff, a quiet, efficient housekeeper, and a chef who cooked gourmet meals she had no appetite for. A black SUV with 2 stone-faced security guards was parked outside at all times. It was by any measure a life of unimaginable luxury, and it was the loneliest place she had ever been. Damian kept his distance, true to his word. Their interactions were brief, almost clinical, conducted through Arthur or the head of his security team. He was providing for her, protecting her, but he was keeping himself walled off from the messy, emotional reality of her presence. Matilda was a more frequent visitor. She would arrive bearing expensive gifts, cashmere baby clothes, antique silver rattles, and would inquire after Elara's health with the focused concern of a prize-winning breeder checking on their thoroughbred mare. She was kind in her own imperious way, but Elara always felt less like a person and more like a precious, fragile vessel. The haunting began subtly. It started with a series of anonymous messages on her long-dormant social media accounts filled with vitriol calling her a homewrecker and a gold digger. Then a blog post appeared titled, "The Truth About the Blackwood Maid." It was a twisted, venomous account of her marriage to Markham, filled with fabricated stories and half-truths that painted her as a manipulative, cheating wife who had trapped an innocent billionaire. The details were intimate enough to be convincing, and it was clear Markham was the source. Elara tried to ignore it, to tell herself that the words of strangers didn't matter. But the poison seeped in, making her feel dirty, judged, and exposed. Then the attacks escalated. One afternoon, a delivery van which had been cleared at the main gate arrived at the bungalow. The driver delivered a large, opulent bouquet of roses. When the housekeeper brought it inside, Elara saw that all the roses were black, their petals dry and brittle, and they smelled faintly of decay. Tucked inside was a small, elegant card. It read, "You can't hide forever." She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. He had gotten something past the first line of defense. The security team was apologetic, promising to tighten protocols, but the message had been delivered. The cage was not impenetrable. The final blow came a week later. She received a call from a number she didn't recognize. It was Mr. Henderson. His voice was strained, terrified. "Elara, "I'm so sorry to bother you," he stammered. "Mr. Henderson, what's wrong?" "A man came to see me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your ex-husband. He didn't threaten me, not exactly, but he made it clear. He said if I was your friend, I should advise you to leave, to disappear. He said that if you stayed, things might get difficult for everyone you used to know." The line went dead in Elara's ear. The phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. This was a new, more insidious level of cruelty. They were no longer targeting her. They were targeting the few people who had ever shown her kindness. They were isolating her, completely burning every bridge back to her old life. The temptation to flee, to pack a bag and disappear into the night was overwhelming. She could run, change her name, and raise her children in some quiet, anonymous town where no one knew the names Blackwood or Markham. But as she stood in the opulent silence of her gilded cage, she placed a hand on her belly, where the first definite flutters of life had begun. She thought of her 3 children, of the future Damian had promised them, of the safety these walls, however flawed, represented. Her fear did not vanish, but it was forged under the intense pressure of her maternal love into something harder, something colder. It became a diamond-hard resolve. They thought they could break her spirit. They thought they could make her run. They had misjudged her. She was not the timid woman Markham had married. She was not the invisible cafeteria worker. She was a mother, and she was done being haunted. She would not run from the ghosts of her past. She would turn and face them. The beautiful gilded cage of the Rosewood bungalow had begun to feel more like a prison cell. The constant low-grade terror of Markham's harassment had succeeded in one thing: it had stripped away Elara's illusion of safety. The walls, the guards, the gates, they were all a comforting lie. A ghost could still seep through the cracks, and that ghost was poisoning her peace. She refused to be a prisoner. After a week of feeling trapped, of pacing the luxurious rooms like a caged animal, she decided she needed air, a change of scenery, a reminder that the world was larger than her 4 walls. She informed her security detail that she wanted to visit the old conservatory on the northernmost edge of the estate, a beautiful glass house filled with exotic plants that had been Matilda's pet project for decades. It was a simple request, a trip of less than a mile within the supposedly secure perimeter of the estate. The head of her detail agreed, assigning 1 guard to accompany her in the small electric golf cart used for navigating the sprawling grounds, while the other would follow in the security SUV. No one noticed the new gardener, a man with nondescript features and calloused hands, who had spent the morning diligently trimming the hedges near the motor pool. And no one saw him spend 2 silent, focused minutes underneath the golf cart. Elara was scheduled to use his work with a pair of wire cutters, swift and precise. A few minutes later, on the opposite side of the estate, a small contained electrical fire broke out in a pump house, a carefully designed diversion that immediately drew the attention of the main security hub and pulled Elara's follow car away to assist in the emergency. The plan, orchestrated by Isabel and executed by Markham's hired thugs, was flawlessly simple. All it needed now was its victim. Elara settled into the passenger seat of the golf cart, the guard driving. The air was warm and smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming roses. For a few moments she felt a sense of peace. The path wound through a grove of ancient oak trees, before beginning a long, gentle slope down toward the conservatory, which glittered like a jewel in the afternoon sun. At the bottom of the hill, the path took a sharp turn, bordered by a low but solid centuries-old stone wall. "It's beautiful out here," Elara said, taking a deep breath. The guard nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Yes, ma'am." As they reached the crest of the hill, he pressed his foot on the brake pedal to control their descent. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder this time. The cart, instead of slowing, seemed to pick up a slight bit of speed, pulled by the gentle but insistent tug of gravity. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "That's odd," he muttered, pumping the pedal. Elara's fragile sense of peace evaporated. "What's wrong?" "The brakes," he said, his voice now tight with alarm. "They're not responding." The cart was moving faster now, its silent electric motor no match for the incline. The gentle slope had become a terrifying runway. The oak trees blurred past them. The conservatory at the bottom of the hill rushed toward them, and with it, the sharp, unforgiving turn and the stone wall. Damian stood in the central security nexus of the main house, a room of dark, cool metal and 100 silent screens. He was reviewing the logs from the main gate, his frustration mounting into a cold rage. The delivery of the dead roses, the anonymous blog posts, They were all pinpricks psychological attacks, but he felt a deeper, more violent threat simmering just beneath the surface. His instincts were screaming that this was an escalation. "Sir, we have a minor electrical fire in the south pump house," the chief of security reported, his voice calm over the comms. "Unit 2 is responding." Damian barely registered it. His eyes were scanning the live feeds from around the estate. He saw Elara and her guard in the golf cart beginning their journey. He watched them disappear into the oak grove. His attention was then drawn to the pump house feed, watching the security SUV arrive. A diversion. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden ice-cold certainty. His eyes snapped back to the camera feed that covered the conservatory hill. He saw it just as it was happening. The golf cart emerging from the trees, moving far too fast. It was careening out of control, a silent missile aimed directly at the stone wall. He didn't think. He didn't analyze. He didn't call for security. A primal roar of pure, unthinking terror ripped through him. He sprinted from the room, his mind wiped clean of everything but a single blinding imperative: Elara. The world narrowed to the thunder of his own feet on the marble floors, the burning in his lungs. He burst out of the French doors onto the back terrace and ran, his long legs eating up the manicured lawn. The past and the present collided in a sickening high-speed crash in his own mind. He saw the twisted metal of his parents' car, the blinding headlights, the woman's scream. And he saw the golf cart hurtling toward its own devastating impact. The guard was trying to steer to swerve onto the grass, but the cart's momentum was too great. Elara was braced against the dashboard, her face a mask of sheer terror, one hand instinctively clutching her stomach. Damian saw it all in a horrifying slow-motion clarity: the cart, the wall, the woman carrying his children. His terror for her was a supernova, an explosion of feeling so immense it incinerated 20 years of carefully constructed walls, phobias, and fears. The deep-seated trauma that had defined his entire adult life was burned to ash in the face of this new, more powerful terror of losing her. He didn't even feel his legs pumping. He just knew he had to get there. He reached the path just as the cart careened past, its wheels skidding on the gravel. He ran alongside it, matching its terrifying speed for a few crucial seconds. "Jump!" he roared, but he knew she was too frozen with fear. There was no time. The wall was feet away. Without a single conscious thought, without a flicker of his old revulsion, he reached into the cart. His hands closed around her, one arm clamping around her waist, the other around her shoulders. He felt the warmth of her body, the soft fabric of her dress, the solid living reality of her. And then he pulled. He yanked her from the seat with a powerful, desperate heave, just as the guard leaped from the other side. Damian twisted his body, wrapping his arms around her, turning himself into a human shield as they tumbled onto the soft grass of the embankment. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from him, but his grip on Elara never loosened. He held her tight against his chest, her face buried in his shoulder as the world spun around them. A split second later, there was a sickening crunch of fiberglass and metal meeting stone as the golf cart slammed into the wall and crumpled into a broken wreck. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the chirping of birds and their own ragged, desperate breaths. Damian was lying on the grass, his arms wrapped around Elara. He was holding her. He was touching her. His skin was in contact with hers. And the only thing he felt was a wave of relief so profound, so absolute, that it felt like he was breathing for the first time in his life. She was safe. He slowly loosened his grip, his hands moving to her shoulders to push her up slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with adrenaline. "Are the babies—" "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. She was staring at him, not with fear, but with a look of utter stunned disbelief. She wasn't looking at the wreck. She was looking at his hands, which were still resting firmly on her arms. He had saved her. He had touched her. He followed her gaze, and the reality of what he had done finally hit him. He was holding her. Willingly. Consciously. And the ghosts were silent. The fire was gone. There was no pain, no memory, no terror. There was only the solid warmth of her arm beneath his hand, and the frantic, beautiful beat of her pulse. The walls were gone. The sound of running feet and shouting voices broke the spell. The security detail, having realized the diversion, was sprinting toward them, their faces ashen. Damian helped Elara to her feet, his hand never leaving her arm, a steady, grounding presence. He looked at the wrecked cart, then at the pale, terrified faces of his security team. The relief that had flooded him moments ago was now crystallizing into something else, a cold, murderous rage. This was not faulty wiring. This was not an accident. This was an attack. An attempt on her life. On his children's lives. They had brought the war inside his fortress. He escorted Elara back to the main house, surrounded by a now frantic circle of guards. After a doctor had thoroughly examined her and declared both her and the babies miraculously unharmed, just shaken, Damian stood by the window in the library, the same window where his grandmother had confronted him weeks before. He was no longer the haunted man trapped by his past. He was a man with a new, terrifyingly clear purpose. He turned to Arthur, who stood waiting, his face grim. This was not a mechanical failure. Damian said, his voice quiet, but resonating with a lethal calm. This was an attempt on her life. He walked to his desk and met his assistant's gaze, his eyes like chips of flint. Find out who was responsible. I want the name of the gardener who was hired last week. I want the source of the electrical fire. I want to know who is funding my ex-wife's ex-husband. Use every resource we have. Burn every source, bribe every official. I don't care what it costs or what laws we have to break. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, colder and sharper than any blade. Find them and bring them to me. The hunt was no longer for a ghost in an elevator. It was for the monsters who had tried to take his future away from him. The rage that settled in Damian Blackwood was not a hot explosive force. It was a glacier, cold, silent, and utterly unstoppable. In the hours after the attack on Elara, his entire empire was repurposed for a single mission: retribution. The hunt had begun, and it was led by an unleashed Arthur Pendleton. Arthur, no longer a corporate assistant but a field marshal commanding a private army of investigators, hackers, and specialists in persuasion, moved with terrifying efficiency. The new gardener was located within 3 hours, found in a cheap motel on the city's outskirts, his pockets full of cash. The man was a low-level thug who folded completely under interrogation, giving up Markham's name and a description of a handler who paid in cash. Simultaneously, a cyber forensics team operating in a legal gray area traced the financial breadcrumbs. The untraceable credit card Isabel had given Markham was a ghost funded through a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts. But Damian's resources were deeper than Isabel's caution. His team peeled back the layers of the onion one by one, a process that normally took weeks, but with an unlimited budget and a singular obsessive focus, they did it in 48 hours. The money trail ended at a holding company in the Cayman Islands named Sterling Acquisitions. The final damning piece of evidence came from the hotel where Isabel had met Markham. The private room was not under surveillance, but the corridor outside was. Arthur's team acquired the footage. It showed Isabel Sterling entering the room, followed 10 minutes later by a nervous-looking Markham. An hour later, Markham left, his face flushed with a new, greedy confidence. It was the smoking gun. Arthur compiled the data into a single encrypted file. Financial records, the thug's signed confession timelines, and the crystal-clear surveillance footage. He presented it to Damian in the library. Damian watched the entire presentation without a word, his face as still and hard as the granite mantelpiece. When it was over, a long, dangerous silence filled the room. She tried to kill my children, Damian said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. The glacier was ready to move. Set up a meeting with the Sterling Industries board. Tell them I am prepared to discuss a potential merger to end our recent market hostilities. Make sure Isabel is there. She won't be able to resist the chance to see me surrender. While the hunt raged in the digital world, a quiet seismic shift was occurring at the estate. The invisible wall between Damian and Elara had crumbled. The clinical contractual distance was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile intimacy. The day after the incident, he found her sitting in a small, sunlit alcove, a book unread in her lap, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. He brought her a cup of chamomile tea, his own hand steady as he passed her the saucer, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. Neither of them flinched. He didn't leave. He simply sat in the armchair opposite her, not speaking, but just being there. His presence was no longer a source of tension, but a silent, comforting weight. He was a guardian, a sentinel. Elara watched him over the rim of her teacup. The icy control was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer directed inward, holding his own demons at bay. It was directed outward, a shield against the world. She saw the exhaustion in the faint lines around his eyes, the fierce protective fire that burned deep within their glacial depths. He was still a stranger in so many ways, but the man who had pulled her from the path of a crashing vehicle, the man whose arms had been a shield, was someone she was beginning to know. Their fragile alliance, born of necessity, was slowly, quietly transforming into something else. It was a bond forged, not in the darkness of an elevator, but in the crucible of a shared life-threatening moment. The business arrangement was dead. All that was left were two people bound by 3 unborn children, and a danger that had paradoxically brought them closer than they could have ever imagined. The main boardroom at Blackwood Enterprises was a theater of corporate power. A vast obsidian table reflected the moody gray sky outside. Isabel Sterling entered looking radiant and victorious in a sharp white suit. She believed she had driven Damian to the brink. She was here to witness his capitulation and dictate the terms of his surrender. She took her seat opposite him, flanked by her own nervous board members, and gave him a smile that was pure predatory triumph. "Damian," she began, her voice smooth and magnanimous, "I'm so glad we could finally sit down and discuss this like adults. I trust you've seen the wisdom in a collaborative future." Damian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. He let her enjoy her moment for a few seconds before he spoke. "Collaboration is one word for it," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "But I find our recent hostilities have extended beyond the market. They have become personal." On cue, the massive screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life. Arthur Pendleton, standing beside it, began to speak, his voice, the calm, dispassionate tone of a newsreader announcing an apocalypse. On the 7th of last month, Arthur began a payment of $100,000 was transferred from Sterling Acquisitions, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, to an untraceable credit card. Isabel's smile faltered. The screen changed to show the financial flowchart, a damning, undeniable line connecting her company to the card. "That card was used to hire one Mr. Frank Miller," Arthur continued. The screen now showed the headshot of the thuggish gardener. "Mr. Miller, in a signed and videotaped confession, has admitted to accepting payment to tamper with a vehicle on the Blackwood estate, an act which directly endangered the life of Ms. Elara Vance." A wave of shocked murmurs went through the Sterling board members. Isabel's face had gone pale. "This is absurd. A fabrication." "Is it?" Damian's voice was silk and steel. The screen changed again, now showing the silent, high-definition security footage from the hotel corridor. Isabel, in her blood-red gala gown, entering the private room. Markham looking sleazy and desperate following her in. "The metadata confirms this footage was taken 2 days after the gala," Arthur stated calmly. "An hour after Mr. Markham left this meeting, he began a campaign of systematic harassment against Ms. Vance, culminating in the attempted murder of her and her unborn children." Isabel leapt to her feet, her composure finally shattering. "This is an outrage. You have no proof I had anything to do with that." "Don't we?" Damian asked softly. He nodded to Arthur. The final piece of evidence appeared on the screen, a single line from the thug's confession. "The man who paid me, Markham, he told me the lady in charge, the rich one, said to break her spirit, and that if something unfortunate happened to the babies, it would be a bonus." It was over. The faces of her own board members were masks of horror and betrayal. They were staring at her not as a leader, but as a monster. The full, unedited file, including evidence of corporate espionage dating back 6 months, was delivered to the district attorney's office 1 hour ago. Damian said, his voice flat and final. He stood up. "I believe this meeting is concluded." Isabel Sterling, the brilliant, ruthless predator, simply collapsed into her chair, her face ashen, her empire, and her life utterly and irrevocably destroyed. The final piece of business was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. Markham was brought not to Damian, but to a sterile conference room in a downtown law firm. Damian appeared on a large video screen, his face cold and impassive, a remote digital god passing judgment. A lawyer laid out the terms. Markham could face a slew of charges as Isabel's accomplice, conspiracy, attempted murder, that would send him to prison for the better part of his life. Or he could sign a full confession, implicating Isabel, plead guilty to lesser charges of harassment and stalking, and be bound by a restraining order so severe it would legally bar him from setting foot in the same state as Elara or her children for the rest of his life. Markham stripped of his benefactor, his greed, and his bluster broke. He sobbed, he begged, and then he signed everything, his signature, a shaky, pathetic scrawl. He was no longer a ghost to be feared. He was just a broken, pitiful man erased from their lives forever. That evening, the storm that had been gathering for months finally passed. The air at the estate felt different, lighter. Damian found Elara in the rose garden standing by the fountain, the setting sun turning the water to liquid gold. He came to stand beside her, the silence between them comfortable, easy. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. "Isabel and Markham. They can't hurt you anymore." He paused, then added the words that mattered most. "You're safe now." Elara turned to him, and for the first time she saw the full weight of the past weeks lift from his shoulders. She saw the man, not the CEO or the myth. She saw the fierce protector, the man who had faced down his own ghost to save her. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words were not for the security or the money. They were for him, for what he had done. He simply nodded, his eyes holding hers. The external threats were gone. All the enemies had been vanquished. Now there was nothing left but the two of them standing in the quiet of a garden with the vast uncharted territory of their own future stretching out before them. The silence that descended upon the Blackwood estate in the wake of the storm was not empty. It was a rich, restorative quiet filled with unspoken understanding and the slow, steady rhythm of two people learning to breathe the same air. The army of security guards became a less obtrusive presence, the ever-present tension replaced by a fragile, budding peace. The arrangement, the contract, was a ghost of the past. All that remained was the quiet, complicated truth of their new reality. Damian found himself drawn to the sprawling, sun-drenched kitchen of the main house. It was a space he had never entered, a place of noise and aromas that had been foreign to his sterile world. Now it had become his sanctuary, because it was hers. He would watch mesmerized as Elara cooked. With her pregnancy advancing, she moved with a more deliberate grace, but her hands were a blur of confident, joyful energy. She was not just making food, she was painting with flavors, conducting a symphony of scents. In the kitchen, she was not the woman who had been terrorized, not the vessel for his heirs. She was an artist, a creator, a force of life, and he found himself utterly captivated. "Tell me about it," he said one afternoon, his voice quiet from the doorway. She was kneading dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up surprised. "Tell you about what?" "This," he gestured around the kitchen. "Your passion. Where did it come from?" And so she told him. She spoke of a childhood spent in her grandmother's kitchen, of learning that love could be an ingredient, that a shared meal was a form of communion. She spoke of her dream, the one she had buried under the weight of a bad marriage and financial hardship, of opening a small restaurant of her own, a place of warmth and honest, beautiful food. As she spoke, he saw the vibrant, brilliant woman who had been hiding beneath the surface of the quiet cafeteria worker. In turn, she began to see the man behind the myth. She asked him not about his business, but about his life, about the books he read, the music that moved him. She discovered a dry, unexpected wit, a brilliant mind that was fascinated by everything from astrophysics to ancient history, and a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. They were two isolated islands, slowly, tentatively beginning to realize they were part of the same continent. The true turning point came on a rainy evening, much like the one that had started it all. A fire crackled in the library's massive hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of books. They sat in comfortable silence, a chessboard between them, though neither had made a move in 10 minutes. "I've never told anyone the full story," Damian said. Suddenly, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the flames. "About the accident." Elara waited, her heart still. She knew this was a threshold, a door to the most secret, guarded room of his soul. He told her everything. He spoke not just of the crash, but of the moments before, of his father's laughter, of his mother singing along to the radio. He described the suffocating darkness, the terror of being a helpless child trapped in a tomb of twisted metal. And then, his voice dropping to a near whisper, he spoke of the woman who had tried to save him. She was a stranger, he said, his eyes distant. She was trying to help. But when the second car hit, her hand was on my arm. My child's mind couldn't separate the two events. The touch that was meant to save me became inextricably linked with more pain, more loss. For 20 years, every time a woman got too close, every time I felt that potential for contact, I wasn't in the present. I was back in that car, waiting for the impact. He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a vulnerability she had only glimpsed once before in the total darkness of the elevator. "Until you," he whispered. "In the elevator in the dark, I was terrified, but your voice, it was an anchor. And when I pulled you from that cart, my only thought was that I couldn't lose you. The fear of what might happen to you was infinitely greater than any ghost from my past. He stood up and walked to where she sat kneeling before her chair. He took her hands in his grip gentle but firm, his touch now as natural as breathing. There was no hesitation, no fear. I fell in love with a voice in the dark, Elara, he said, his gaze holding hers. And I've spent every day since falling in love with the woman it belongs to. With your strength, your kindness, your fire. Tears welled in Elara's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. I don't want a business arrangement, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I don't want a contract. I want a life with you. I want to build a family with you, not because of a legacy, but because I cannot imagine a future that you are not at the center of. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. It did not contain a massive, ostentatious diamond. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, a band of platinum intricately woven to look like a vine, with 3 tiny, brilliant diamonds nestled among the leaves like buds on a branch. Elara Vance, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Will you build that life with me? Will you marry me? Her answer was a choked, tearful sob that was pure joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. The ghosts had been vanquished. The walls had fallen. And in the warm, quiet library, surrounded by the stories of the past, 2 people, once broken and alone, finally began to write a new story of their own together. Epilogue, 4 years later. The air in the kitchen of Sage, the city's most celebrated new restaurant, was a symphony of controlled, delicious chaos. It smelled of searing duck fat, fresh tarragon, and melting chocolate. In the center of it all, Chef Elara Vance, her name now spoken with reverence in culinary circles, calmly instructed a line of disciplined young cooks. Plate the quail now, Thomas. Leo, I need that sauce. Sharper, cleaner. Her restaurant, her dream, was a resounding success, but it was not her greatest creation. A chaotic, joyful whirlwind erupted from the back office as 3 small children, a storm of flailing limbs and delighted shrieks, burst into the kitchen. Mommy yelled, Michael the boldest, a miniature Damian with Elara's warm eyes. Mommy look, squealed Lily, holding up a drawing of a lopsided flower. And then came Noah, the quietest, who simply ran and wrapped his arms around Elara's legs, burying his face in her apron. Following them, looking utterly unperturbed by the chaos, was Damian. The severe, untouchable billionaire was gone. In his place was a man in a soft cashmere sweater, a faint smudge of what looked like jelly on his cheek. His eyes filled with a deep, easy contentment. He was no longer a man living in a fortress. He was a man living in a family. Sorry, he said with a smile that reached his eyes. They staged a jailbreak while I was on a call. Elara laughed, a sound that was full and bright. She crouched down, wiping Noah's nose and admiring Lily's drawing. It's beautiful, sweetie. Now you 3 know the rules. No running in the kitchen. But Daddy promised us dessert, Michael declared. Damian scooped him up, settling him on his hip with practiced ease. And Daddy always keeps his promises, he said, nuzzling his son's neck, eliciting a fit of giggles. He looked at Elara over his children's heads, his expression full of a love so profound it needed no words. His trauma was not a myth that had magically vanished. It was a healed-over wound, its scar a reminder not of pain, but of the woman who had taught him how to live and love again. He had found his recipe for life. It was a complex blend of unexpected ingredients, 1 part terrifying darkness, 2 parts fierce strength, and 3 parts chaotic, beautiful, unconditional love. They had not had a fairy tale beginning, but together they had built a real and lasting happiness, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that begin by accident in the dark, with nothing but the sound of a stranger's voice to guide you home. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope the story of Elara and Damian has touched your heart. If you enjoyed their story, please take a moment to give this video a like to let us know. And to ensure you don't miss out on our next tale, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are so grateful for your time and support, and we look forward to sharing another story with you very soon.